This session, Flourishing Congregations in Canada, preliminary observations there, really that's just very preliminary as we start to piece these things together. But it is our attempt to capture how do leaders describe and explain these aspects of congregational life. Our aim in this session is to take a 39,000-foot altitude approach to explore how leaders in Catholic, mainline, and conservative Protestant congregations conceptualize what a flourishing congregation looks like or ought to look like in a Canadian context. In pursuing this task, we make two assumptions clear from the outset. First, we are presenting leader perceptions of flourishing congregations. At this point in the study, our research team cannot state with confidence what traits are actually and commonly evident in congregations that are flourishing. So far, our research has been delimited to the window afforded by about 100 academics, denominational, and congregation leaders. So we can only state that this is what a select set of leaders have reported to us about their congregations and experiences. We'll have more to say about this as we engage other research methods later in the project, ethnographic research, surveys, with a range of other participants, congregants and first-hand observers. For example, if one of the leaders we interviewed identified diversity as a desirous trait of a flourishing congregation and claimed that their congregation is diverse, a sociologist might ask, how do congregants perceive and experience this or other kinds of diversity? Do members of different subgroups sit beside one another on Sunday mornings, for example, or interact with one another in various ministry settings? What attitudes and behaviors does one find among congregants regarding other subgroups in the congregation? Later we'll talk about phase 2 and phase 3 of this project, which I think will help us to test some of these and many other perceptions that emerge from leaders in phase 1 of this study. So once more, this is very much a preliminary preview of some of our initial findings. Second assumption behind all of these, the traits and characteristics associated with flourishing congregations that we will discuss depict what Max Weber, one of the founders of sociology, called ideal types. An ideal type is a literary construct or expression of a particular concept. It may not actually exist in reality, but it serves as an analytical description, explanation, measure, and representation of a concept resembling what might be found in concrete cases. Ideal types are useful points when one begins to explore concepts to possibly refine, clarify, and develop more precise understandings and measurements. And I would say this is the task that we have started on when it comes to trying to understand what exactly is a flourishing congregation. Yes. In other words, we don't claim that a leader's definition of description A, for example, of a flourishing congregation is better or worse than definition B, right? Our task in using ideal types is not intended to be normative or evaluative in any respect. We have simply developed ideal types of features of flourishing congregations based on what we have heard leaders tell us. Of course, it is highly unlikely that there are congregations that embody each and all traits associated with any ideal type, as interviewees made very clear to us during our time with them. So I'm going to hand the floor over to Arch, who's going to begin us in talking through some of these findings, and then we'll kind of move our way to each member of the team.
Thanks, Joel. The following section captures how interviewees conceptualize and operationalize what a flourishing congregation looks like to them. Now, given the preliminary nature of our analysis, we hold, as Joel says, these categories and categorizations and descriptions rather loosely. Admittedly, it's difficult to conclude whether or not these characteristics are precursors or conditions for a congregation to flourish. Perhaps some are the results manifested in congregations that flourish, or perhaps the types and indicators should be seen as representing some combinations of traits and states. Moreover, without probing further in phase 2 and 3 of this study, it's hard to assess whether these are lived realities, aspirational goals, beliefs, and values, or a blend of the three. So if they are lived realities or aspirational goals, these can be empirically measured. Now, if they are intrinsic values, that are, say, held dearly by our participants, these become a little bit more difficult to measure. And last, we are cognizant that the ways that congregation-based and denominational leaders describe flourishing congregations may reveal, specific theological, sociological, practical assumptions and commitments. So part of our task in this project will be clearly to identify the varied and interrelated ways that these emerge. Now, first, in many of our focus groups and interviews, one of the initial responses to the question, what comes to mind when you hear the phrase flourishing congregations? It always pertains to the size of a congregation. Some were quick to separate or decouple the notion of flourishing from a relative size of a congregation. Now, a United Church of Canada minister in Halifax states, quote, "I think we have to decouple flourishing from numbers. I'm not adverse to numbers, but I'm concerned that in our society, what gets counted is the only thing that seems to matter. And there may be places that are flourishing where it's not possible for there to be numerical growth. And the realities of the Maritimes is real depopulation, and that's true in other places as well." Now, here we see an example of how particularities for a congregation in a rural context and in the Maritimes, environmental conditions such as declining population contributes to a congregation's realities, and how this in turn shapes how they think about what constitutes flourishing. Now, others suggest that rather than measuring flourishing by numbers, one ought to look at transformed lives and communities. I think they're trying maybe to make themselves feel better. I'm not sure. But one church leader reflective of others cited, "I would say it's not numerical. It's about people attending to what matters most, people being engaged, people being hoping, people owning their own faith, people celebrating that, people working to make the world a better place." Now, a denominational leader in the Presbyterian Church of Canada revealed, "I'm not convinced that the numbers are as key anymore. It's more fundamental than that. And so the transformational models of churches, incarnational churches, they sometimes call them, I think become more the key approach, I think, for a vital church for now and for the future." Now, conversely, other leaders are adamant that a congregation that is not growing numerically, measured by things such as church attendance, membership, or adherence, baptisms, conversions, or financial donations, is not flourishing. And a leader of a conservative Protestant congregation with over 600 weekly attenders reflected, "In many ways, I would say we believe that qualitative growth ultimately must show itself in quantitative growth." And a Catholic priest in Alberta says, "I think the first thing you would think of in a flourishing congregation would be the numbers, the attendees, the flourishing. We always think quantity. As much as we would like to detach those material things from what we would consider a flourishing church, community, or congregation, when a group is flourishing, there will be manifestations, and often it is in numbers. Often it is in the sense of service and what they offer to the community." And so you can't help but connect those things when a group is flourishing, he says, end of quote. And of course, this narrative that associates flourishing with numbers is easy for some. Most Catholic leaders that we interviewed highlight the following sentiment. Oftentimes, Catholics think in terms of, let's set up a parish and people will come to us because it happens. We have no problems with our numbers, they say. Again, a Catholic priest in British Columbia says, "We're not too worried about growth, really. I mean, it's going to grow, but we're not focused a lot on that." We heard countless narratives of Catholic parishes with, well over 1,000+ weekly attenders, where their greatest concern was not having enough seats for all those who want to attend Mass. And the reason? Catholic schools. which are believed to link students and their families to regular mass attendance, and immigration, as Joel alluded to. Themes that, again, we'll explore in much greater detail later. Now, the phenomenon of flourishing churches, planting churches, is really a notable reframe among some representing congregations who value quantitative matrix. And this was most common among newer church plants and with some ethnic congregations who were encountered, that we encountered in this first phase of our research. For instance, some leaders shared that 2 church congregations had been birthed out of their congregation in the past 5 years, and their goal to birth another 2 in the next 5 years. A pastor of a multi-ethnic congregation in Ontario stated that his congregation basically just exists to multiply, to just keep giving birth. Even as they plant, they already have a strategy to plant within a year or 2 again. And it's that whole concept. It's not a church that is that worries about okay, how are we going to pay the bills, or how we pay for this, or how are we going to survive. It's a multiplying concept. So several questions arise for us. And we plan to develop and look into this as this study progresses. So it's this. What are the underlying narratives at work between the 2 differing expressions of flourishing here? Are smaller congregations less inclined to associate numerical growth with flourishing, with vice versa among larger congregations? Or is there more of a nuanced middle position here? Are some seeking to detach Canadian understandings of flourishing from perceived American ones, where megachurches are far more common? Do denominational and church leaders distance themselves from numbers as a way to, psychologically cope with the realities of their congregations, and many around them, struggle to sustain numbers or grow numerically? Or are there possible theological reasons for connecting or disconnecting flourishing from numerical numbers? Second, a unifying narrative among many of the leaders who we interacted with involved the possession of a clear self-identity. And these congregations were described as having a firm grasp of who they were and what the congregation was, and what the congregation is, and what the congregation aspires to be. And for the leaders that we heard that a clear self-identity included a realization that congregations do not strive to become like the church, down the road, so to speak. Nor do they try to be all things to all people. They are unique in some respects. So to this end, several shared that their identity might be captured on a T-shirt or a bus advertisement, ensuring that their core purpose was memorable. And by extension, participants indicated that congregations who are not clear on their central purpose and identity struggle to flourish, especially in the Canadian context where many congregations fight to remain relevant and keep the doors open in a progressively secular setting. Now, this Catholic leader spoke about congregational identity in this way, quote, "When you develop a sense of identity, you begin to have that sense of conviction, sense of direction. It helps you in your leadership. You can't help but grow. People find it attractive when a group or a person knows what it's all about, right? And they want to belong to something that they can relate to. And they do tend to be hospitable because people who know themselves as an organization, I think, will truly want to reach out and share the good news." Now, as for the content of a congregation's identity, this varies. Now, we heard responses that range from theological particulars to ethnic and multi-ethnic focus to a neighborhood parish church, to a single or multi-generational congregation, to an evangelistic emphasis, among other areas. Yet one recurring theme arose across the theological continuum for us. A congregation's identity is rooted in the spiritual life, in various religious beliefs and practices, and ultimately around Jesus. For instance, Catholics in this research singled out the sacrament of the church as a core to congregational identity. A conservative Protestant leader in Ontario proclaimed, "I think there is an identity being rooted in Jesus." And they have that clear sense of their identity as a congregation extending from Jesus, his mission, his life, and presence among them. And we'll say more about these identity markers in the next section on vibrant spiritual life. Still, not all participants, agreed with the blanket correlation between clear self-identity and congregations that flourish. One focus group participant carefully noted that congregations may have a clear self-identity, yet not flourish. If you look at he says, quote, "If you look at the traits without the descriptors, they could actually be a symptom of an unflourishing church. So I've met congregations on the verge of closure that have a clear self-identity." End of quote. Now, the inference was that a congregation's self-identity could be anchored around beliefs and practices that do not generate numerical growth or healthy organizational dynamics or transformed individuals. And this begs the question, are there certain beliefs, practices, struggles, and or ideologies that bind flourishing congregations together? Can one advance a case that while congregations have what they believe to be a unique self-identity, there are shared identity-related realities that bind many churches together? And thus far, our sense is that at the macro level, or the bigger level, macro level, there are some unifying commonalities in how church leaders think about the identity of flourishing congregations. And the remaining observations capture, hopefully, these similarities across traditions and regions. And third, a cornerstone feature of congregation's identity, it's value for an opportunity to develop a vibrant, collective spiritual life. In the words of one leader, to smell like Jesus. And though this statement is full of meaning and assumptions that we intend to probe further as this research project develops, we listen to a range of stories detailing the role that prayer, that scripture, that the Eucharist, that the Holy Spirit, fasting, and other spiritual disciplines reportedly played for leaders and their congregants in flourishing congregations. For instance, some interviewees identify particular seasons of intense prayer and fasting as catalysts for flourishing in their context. Now, two specific themes stand out to us regarding a vibrant collective spiritual life: religious experience and transformed lives. Okay? Religious experience and transformed lives. Participants expressed that flourishing congregations created opportunities for individuals to meaningfully experience God. And these were centrally available to congregants in weekly services. And several interviewees spoke about the distinct energy that was felt in flourishing congregations in weekly services. So a few described what this, energy kind of looked like and felt like. One would just know when they sensed it. And a United Church minister expressed that it just has energy. You feel it. For a Catholic leader, a purposeful, thoughtful, and considered liturgy, with the high point obvious of the Eucharist, stood out above all things for the vibrant collective spiritual life. One Catholic priest, characteristic of several of his peers, shared the following question and response concerning people experiencing God in weekly Mass. quote, how can we create an atmosphere where we can provide a God moment encounter for people walking through the front door? So whether it's as soon as they grab that front door and they walk in, there's got to be a feeling there in the air from the person they meet first to get a smile, to perhaps it's the way that the worship happens, or if it's a special event and it's the music and the message. And so I just throw that out there for ourselves, is when someone has a God moment, lives change. And I think that's still an important thing to try to facilitate the God moment, end of quote. Now, the end of this statement captures the sentiment of many who we interviewed, that meaningful experiences with God leads to transformed lives. And so, expressed differently, while denominational and congregational leaders are interested in helping congregants foster attitudes and behaviors associated with a vibrant collective spiritual life, the ultimate expression of a vibrant spiritual life is a transformed personal life. So an Anglican leader described the following goal in their congregational activities. Quote, lives change. Changed lives. For me, it's not about being friendly. I can go to the Rotary Club to find friendly people. I need to see, and the litmus test for me is your life changed? Is it growing? Are you grounded? Is there maturity? Is there sanctification? But the point is, it happens. For me, that's one of the things I'm looking for. I need to see lives change because I see so much broken otherwise. That's it. End of quote. And one of our central aims for the later phases of this research will entail a broader and a deeper examination of these various beliefs and practices among congregants themselves. I'm going to give Keith, as we walk through the next several traits. Keith.
Thanks, Arch. Yes, I'm going to deal with three themes: discipleship, leadership, and then something we've called, as you at some point look at the manuscript, out-of-the-box ideas here, and just to give you a bit of a preview of some of those thoughts. I want to, again, emphasize, you've been hearing the word preliminary quite a bit. Maybe to give that a little bit more legs, you know, we've got hundreds of hours of interviews, all of which have been transcribed along with focus groups. And the exciting thing to me is that what I'm hearing as I sit there, and perhaps you're hearing the same thing, is just there's a lot of interesting data here, some findings. But we've just begun, actually, this is phase 1, part A, lowercase. And so I think the prospects, as I listen to all, and we're talking out loud in some ways for the first time, having put some of this together, very excited about that. And so as we move to discipleship, and some of the things that we heard as we listened to focus groups and interviews, certainly there was discipleship described as an end, or the end in some cases. This is actually what we're about. This defines who we are. We are about, and really when it comes down to it, only making disciples. That's kind of our job. And so that teleological, or that end piece, came through very strongly, and actually many of the comments that I'll make, both in terms of the discipleship piece and leadership, and certainly what I could also say about innovation. I won't characterize according to the three different sectors that of people that we were working with, because there's a fair bit of commonality there. Discipleship was also talked about in terms of the essence of what it is that we do. So an end, but also describing not just what we want, but what would describe the kind of activity that goes on here that could be described fundamentally in essence as discipleship. So many of the people that we were listening to describe discipleship as a process In some instances, even using words like to produce disciples, right through to engaging people in processes where they would themselves, with God, become disciples, apprentices, followers in a richer, deeper, more meaningful way for them and the people they live with and the people they affect. But with that, talking about tinkering with process, trying to get it just right in terms of as people come in the front door or as the church scattered moves out into the areas, what does it actually look like to engage in the journey of discipleship, and how differentiated it is and how collective it is in terms of systems and programs and stages and receiving people just as they are, as the hymn sometimes reminds us, and then taking them from there and facilitating, equipping them in processes. And much of what we were hearing had to do with is this a second order or major change that we need to be initiating in our local congregation or in our denomination, or are we just tinkering on the edges to suit those people who are coming our way at different stages and bringing with them and taking out from us different kinds of things? There was a real sense of discipleship in a discipleship as being someone different, living the Christ life. This will come up later in our discussions, but the end for the individual of becoming more like Jesus, or being equipped to do the work of God in the world, to be able to be a disciple in a relational fashion. So a wide variety and certainly lots of echoing across the different denominational and Christian groupings there. There was an interesting aspect of discipleship that had to do with identity. So perhaps a shift in some way from disciples to discipleship. This congregation identifies itself not only by its relationships, but also by its discipleship function, that we are a group of people who have this collective image as disciples, not just personally, but also collectively. And so what we have here under the rubric of discipleship are some broad categories. It's really too early for us because we're just really doing sort of first level coding right now, and only of some of our people, to really make, to even say that we have, in a sense, findings. We have some categories. We have some emerging sense of the variety of the way that we understand across persons, congregations, and groupings this notion of discipleship. But certainly an end has to do with what we do, the essence of it. It involves the processes that we use and implement in the way we see people, and the way we program, and the way we integrate people. But one of the larger pieces, too, was this is discipleship in the context of competing narratives, where people are coming in and have, in so many different ways, no background like they might have once had that can relate to the call to discipleship. And so not only competing in terms of people's sort of antecedent or a prior or a beginning state in terms of who they are as they come to us, but also as they go out into the work life, into their student life. They're constantly having some of the ideal type aspects of our views of discipleship in this particular congregation challenged by those that they work, study, and live with. So very preliminary sketch of the scan of some of the discipleship pieces that are coming, really in a sense an agenda of headings. In terms of leadership, and it's interesting, of course, in research design, we were meeting with leaders, and we were providing them with a forum to provide us with their state-of-the-art, the best of their experience, the last book that they've read, the most difficult challenge that what might be referred to as leadership help them to move into or through to. And so, of course, we heard, and this manuscript will reflect lots of what might be referred to as adjectival leadership. That is leadership that has another word in front of it. Everything from compassionate leadership to Christ-like leadership to fierce leadership, tribal leadership, and so on. You can imagine all of the different adjectives, and we've yet to harvest all of those. But certainly one of the ones that found a great deal of elaboration was strategic leadership. And it was due in part the people that we were actually meeting to that had that particular role within denominations or congregations to be foresighted, to think ahead, to have planning as a part of what they were doing. And part of that, of course, raised issues of succession, issues of how do we best in the academy, whether that's at a seminary or at a Christian university, how do we help form new leaders for the 21st century in Canada to do what we do in congregations and to do what congregations do in so many different kinds of ways and manifestations. But also, what does leadership development look like in our local congregations, and what are the things that we've tried? And so, we netted so many different ideas and so many different initiatives in terms of what was working with respect to leadership development. The issue of what are the skill sets and the competencies that are required for being a part of a flourishing church. It was interesting to hear people's own narrative, something that's not really represented at all in what we're presenting today. But for all of our interviews, we typically ask people about their contexts, because leadership is so situated and contextual, but also about their own context of formation and where they were at in their present state, and what kind of skills that were required, and what ones were maybe a surprise to them that they needed as they were entering in new, or as they were actually riding the life cycle of a particular congregation. And these things you can imagine. I think there was a sense in which there was a great deal of both struggle as well as assumption of needing to be rather loosely coupled with the notions of leadership that maybe they once had in terms of different stages of the congregation, but also different stages of age, when they got their original education, and who they looked to in terms of people. There was certainly in those conversations lots about shared leadership as another adjective, and a bit of a struggle in some cases about how to actually have an inclusive approach to leadership, as well as how to distribute that leadership, and the struggle, and also in a sense finding a place of a good fit, that it was working to actually shift from a leadership as out of authority over into a leadership that is out of, in some ways, defining the realities for people and helping them to originate together some solutions to moving forward, to growing, to even identifying a vision, mission, roles that would actually help them to see the good in what was going on and figuring out how to get more of that happening for them. There was a lot in the area of, it's an emerging theme, I'll put it that way, this notion of a yes culture over and against a control culture, or a contained culture. How is it that we learn how to say yes to things, knowing that our every yes means no to something else, but nonetheless, we need to perhaps be a little less minders of the gate and looking for opportunities that might not be ones that we've actually walked in before. So this what was referred to by a number of people as yes culture. The notion of hiring from within was quite common, actually. And this was often related to the people that we are bringing into positions of formal positional leadership. They understand the DNA. They've watched it grow. They've actually, have been having an interview for the role for the last 20 years or 10 years or whatever. And so this was an interesting piece in terms of how some of these flourishing, how some of these leaders were explaining flourishing in their context. Succession, as I mentioned, was also something that was important, and this was an interesting piece in terms of leadership, not necessarily positional or professional leadership, but in terms of lay leadership, distributed leadership, and balancing leadership, and making sure that there was an eye to sustainability. Even as I walked into this room today, I heard a well-respected pastor just talking. His word to me was trying to do things today that are going to help us to be sustainable for tomorrow, and that whole notion of both leadership succession but also sustainability of the flourishing. This sense that as leaders, when you do find maybe you don't feel like you're flourishing as a whole church, but you find a pocket or a place in your congregation that is flourishing, how do you maintain that? How do you keep that going? And how do you keep that going in a leaderful way with leaders, with constituents that are pleased to see it continue and even get better? I'll then just shift in the last little part of the leadership themes to an adjective which was quite common, and some called it spirit-led leadership, or spirit-indwelt leadership, or spiritually attuned leadership. And this is where people would say to us, as one of the pastors of this congregation, I really do need to be someone who has been with God, and who people can rely on as having been plugged in to God and to know Jesus and to be walking with Him. And there was trepidation in that, but there was also out loud talking about balance of life very often. It got into the personal challenges of life in the pastorate or as a denominational leader as well. And in doing that, enabling other people as well. And so the link between discipleship, if you like, and leadership was quite strongly supported. A good deal of conversation from these people attributing to the flourishing they did see their own spiritual formation, their own disciplines, habits of things they didn't do and things that they did do that formed up not a formula but rather a lifestyle that actually resulted without really their effort, just a sense that God had actually kept their sails full. I'll just move from that skimming through leadership and discipleship then to the next category, which we've just called out of the box. This is sort of the paradigmatic shifting. This was people saying, what's working, or what's working we want to get more of, and we should be giving more attention to it, because apparently if you give attention to things that are working, you'll get more of them. But also to be willing to take some risks, and some of the analysis that, biographically speaking about how they had been risk adverse. And so lots of phrases, everything from run to the fire to even the metaphor of thinking out of the box, thinking differently. And in some cases, talking to a different group of people, even within the congregation or from without the congregation, about what needs were, what might be something that we haven't done before that might be called innovation. And trying, as leaders again, with disciples, to tie those three categories together, to engage people into a place of being ready for change, and talking sometimes about the resistance to change, or the reluctance to change, or even the rebellion to change. There's your 3 R's right off the bat. But what about a readiness to change, a resilience to change, a ability to actually be agile and move quickly to change, and to the struggle of how do we move to change at the same time maintain what it is that we see as part of the core of why it is that we're in existence right now. And so finding niches, moving to those without having the whole mass of energy and economies moving to that, but just gently trying some new things to meet needs. And one of the interesting things that will be very interesting as we proceed in this is this whole notion of what might be referred to, and has been by Rugelman and others, as moral imagination or prophetic imagination. Where does imagination come into this? It's a word that was recurrent in the transcripts we've looked so far. Ways of looking that provide not just rational, operational approaches to things, but that look to imagine and dream about and think about with others, underline with others, what is going well, what could be if we had more of that, and what are some opportunities that might be afforded us in God's economy, and then creating a design, an argument for that as making sense, and then moving forward with that. Just really a little small toe in the ocean of several hundred hours of transcripts, many of which have yet to be read.
Thank you, Keith. Are you folks doing okay? You all right? That's a ton of stuff, we realize. But I teach millennials, and I think one of the hallmarks of millennials is shrunken bladders. Because I'm used to people getting up and walking out of my class. It won't. If you need to stand, you by all means go ahead. Or worse. Yeah. Yeah. You get to my age and it's leg cramps, you know what I mean? And then it's something else. Well, the last 4 areas that I'm going to try to quickly walk us through include hospitable community, neighborhood presence and involvement, evangelism, and diversity. So, as quickly and yet hopefully meaningfully, let's scamper through some of these. We know that sociologically that social ties play an instrumental role in a person joining a religious organization or community and remaining a part of that group. As people feel loved and accepted, cared for and embraced by people in the congregation, they are far more likely to stay, to join, to continue their association with the congregation. Most of the people that we've talked to in our research report that their congregations are hospitable communities. Sure we are. You betcha we're hospitable. But just try to break into that hospitable community. An idea that we will test with congregants later in our phases of research. So we've heard from the leaders, and the leaders are saying, oh, of course, we're hospitable. How could you say otherwise? Well, we're going to ask your people to see how they feel. So what stands out to us from our interviews are the processes that leaders identified to help people join, and remain. One conservative Protestant pastor stressed that in their congregation has, quote, a clear and effective model of ministry. Everyone's not just clear on who we are, where we are going conceptually, but how this works, how our discipleship process works, how we reach people for Christ, how did people get integrated into our church, how did we launch people to live missionally. There's the buzzword for this week. How does it work? What steps do you take? That's a very clear, there's a very clear how between churches that are either not flourishing and or aspiring to be flourishing. He went on to say, I encounter more churches that want to be flourishing or aspire to be flourishing. I encounter more churches that want that than who are. And I don't think that the difference is motivational. The difference isn't that some churches want flourishing more than others. It's that some churches have figured out how to engage their people. For instance, a flourishing congregation leader says that they have a clear, systematic process for identifying newcomers, how you identify newcomers. And having lived in the States for 3 years, did my undergrad in the States, and having gone to American churches, quite frankly, I hate being sung to by a group of people around me to welcome me to church. Don't do that to me. I am Canadian. And don't stick a warm piece of gray fluff on me and call it, we want to give you a warm fuzzy. Well, some churches have a very clear and systematic process for identifying newcomers. Some even have flow charts. Pre, then in, then post. And it flows. Great flow charts. Unlike 1 or 2 generations ago, fewer Canadians have a Christian memory of any kind. Therefore, flourishing congregations believe that they strategically take it upon themselves to help a newcomer learn the culture, be enculturated, learn the beliefs, the rituals, the customs of local congregation. In regard to this, we discovered that Roman Catholic infrastructure, such as its schools, or the rite of Christian initiation for adults, are examples of intentional ways to help socialize people into the local congregational life. They're very intentional. They know where they want you to be, and they know how they want to get you there. Of course, as individuals are drawn into fellowship with local congregations, there are ways to deepen that connection with other members. Leaders shared with us various ways that this occurs in the context of, say, small group discussions, Bible study, prayer groups, or volunteer opportunities, to having people tell their personal stories and testimonies within the context of the weekly liturgy. One Roman Catholic priest in Ontario used the metaphor of family to describe hospitable community in his parish and the importance of participation, especially in the liturgy. The liturgy was very important. And he said this, and I quote, "Everybody in my eyes, the concept of flourishing congregation would be everyone has a place in the family. Doesn't matter if they're 30 people or 30,000 people. Everyone has to have a place in that family in terms of liturgy." I think it's very important that people feel part of the preparations. We have ministers of hospitality. We have people who read. We have children's liturgy. And again, I encourage everyone to become involved in the parish at some level. Pardon me. Well, one of the questions that we want to ask is, what is an indicator that people feel connected? How do we know they feel connected? It could be, as the priest suggests, that members are actively engaged in their church community and they feel a sense of pride in their congregation. This is what he says, and I quote, "A manifestation of a sense of belonging is their engagement in the community life first, either through formal ministry, and secondly, their frequent attendance. That whenever they are here, you really see them, and you can have a sense of pride in them that they love this parish, and that they really want to be counted as people who belong here. They're here regularly. It's interesting, the statistic that's out there now, that in Canada, if a person attends once to twice a month, 12 to 24 services out of 52 weeks, you are considered a regular attender. Well, in my day, tell you what, brother, Sunday morning, we didn't preach one sermon, we preached 2 sermons. Different sermons. Sunday morning, Sunday evening, Wednesday, you know, that was called regular attenders. Well, from past research, we know that as people feel stronger in their connection, they're more likely to reciprocate at higher levels of involvement, volunteering, and including financial contributions as well. So, hospitable community, welcoming people in, feeling that making sure they're connected. Secondly, and this was great fun for me in some of our interviews, neighborhood presence and involvement. As those we interviewed associated a hospitable community with flourishing congregations, leaders, particularly it seemed Protestant ones, were adamant that this hospitality absolutely must extend beyond the walls of our church. In their minds and experiences, flourishing congregations have an active presence and involvement in the welfare and the justice of their neighborhood. Often framed in explicitly theological language such as an incarnational presence or as being the hands and feet of Jesus, those that we interviewed strongly resisted any notion that a flourishing congregation can exist solely for itself. Congregations ought to be actively involved to better their communities, something that the leaders of most congregations we interviewed believe is a reality in their context. One maritime pastor said this: we run a program here in the community as well as downstairs for preschool children in the winter. So this area downstairs is the playground, and it is open 2 to 3 mornings a week to preschool families. So in terms of a church community, the cafe, the ice cream, the indoor playground, and a big community thing, and we host community health programs here. As well as from the community health team. So it is not exactly a community center, but there's a lot coming and going on. One of the examples that stands out in my mind, I've used it as an illustration, and the pastor's here today. He's from Winnipeg. He told me, correct me if I'm wrong, Todd, a visitor came to the church. I think Todd went to see her and welcomed her and said, "Did you come with anybody?" And she said, "Oh, no. You know why she came? Here's why she came. The church decided that the city of Winnipeg had decided there were certain kinds of garbage they would not pick up. It's up to you to get rid of them. The church decided, we'll take your garbage. We'll pick up your garbage." So they did. And he asked this woman what brought her to the church. You know what brought her to the church? The fact that this church said, any church that's willing to pick up my garbage is probably a place I should visit. I love it. There's something metaphorical about that, is there not? Bring your garbage. Join our garbage. Well, upon hearing stories such as these, we often encounter participants that raise the question, and here's the question, and it is this: would our community notice if we were no longer here? Frequently asked. Yes. There are several lines of inquiry that we would like to explore later in our study regarding congregational activities in their neighborhoods. What motivates congregations to be actively? What motivates us to be involved in the community around us? Is this primarily theologically driven? is there something about brand image at work where congregations seek to challenge negative Canadian perceptions toward organized religious groups. You think we're thus and so? Okay, we'll show you. We're going to pick up your garbage or stuff like that. Whatever. And that's not why they didn't. That's not why they did that. All right. Do people find their ways into active involvement in these congregations due to the fact that this church is known in the community? We're going to explore that more. Thirdly, is evangelism. Along with participating in good works in society, leaders across traditions and regions consistently single out evangelism as perhaps one of the most important traits of flourishing congregations. In fact, one interviewee said this, quote, "When I think of flourishing, there is a real sense that people are coming to faith and are growing in their faith. And evangelistic communities have typically measured conversion, and that's a really difficult thing to play with. And so we really look in terms of where baptism occurs and where it occurs in a discipleship journey. And does it lead to ongoing discipleship? Where there's baptism that leads to ongoing discipleship, people are flourishing. And where that's happening, lots of congregations are flourishing." So for those leaders who stress quantitative aspects of flourishing, they did not mince their words on the centrality of congregations that grow via new conversions. A denominational leader said to us, "If you have a church of 100 and you reach 10 people, that's significant. If you go to a church of 1,000 people and you reach 50 people, that should not be celebrating. You should be crying." Well, you know, as a team, we Protestant evangelical white plus one Asian guy team we would probably all have to confess that we were taken aback, caught off guard to hear how many Catholic congregations and mainline Protestant congregations actually have active evangelism programs. Shame on us. And most notably, the Alpha program, which started by Nicky Gumbel, of course, in London, England. This program is designed to guide people exploring Christianity through a series of talks and discussions on core Christian beliefs and practices. The prevalence of an evangelistic focus in the Alpha program specifically is surprising for two reasons. Number one, for several traditions that are not known as evangelistic or evangelical, such as Roman Catholic and mainline Protestant, they raved about how central and effective this program was to their congregation's activities. Love it. Second, given the general Canadian aversion to, quote, pushy evangelism, and actually I think Sam Reimer has written on this, and Joel has written on this, we did not anticipate that Canadian congregations would take up an overt evangelistic strategy such as this. Even those that we interviewed acknowledged the perceived Canadian aversion to evangelism in the form of verbal proclamation, which they lamented particularly in ethnic congregations and evangelical settings. One conservative Protestant denominational leader said this, "I would add evangelism as a separate point because that is the elephant in the room in Canada. Nobody likes it. Nobody wants to do it. Nobody wants anything to do with it." What remains to be seen from our perspective from phase one interviews, which you've heard, have we told you this is preliminary? Okay. And from our focus groups is how effective are these evangelistic initiatives? Are new people joining the Christian faith and local congregation in response to the Alpha program? Are flourishing congregations growing? If they are growing, in large part due to conversion? And if so, what percentage of these congregations could one attribute to conversion growth in contrast to transfer growth, for example? We have our doubts as a team that congregations are growing mainly due to conversion, based on the existing data regarding evangelical congregations. And again, Sam and Mike Wilkinson have written on this. Revelations from many church leaders in this project that the majority of their congregations are filled with those born and raised in their congregation who have, or for those who have transferred from another congregation, adds to our suspicion about evangelism in terms of its effectiveness. Few reported percentages higher than 5 to 10% who were converts due to evangelism of some kind. But phase 3 surveys within this project with congregants themselves should help us to test these ideas further, including a closer examination into the modes and mechanisms that evangelism is practiced and experienced in congregations across the traditions in Canada. Lastly, and I got to scoot through this one. Thank you, Steve. That's lovely. Discovered on my visits to Ireland and Scotland that over there men can say lovely. Diversity. Diversity. A recurring refrain that we heard in focus groups and interviews is that flourishing congregations ought to be diverse communities, or diverse, wherever you're from. As we pressed participants on this issue on what exactly they had in mind, they mainly pointed toward any of the following. It needs to be diverse in terms of race, gender, social class, sexual orientation, and age. They also framed language about diversity in theological language about God's kingdom. During one focus group, for example, someone expressed, I think that if you don't have a fairly rich diversity within your church, it should reflect the demographic diversity of the community. If you don't have that diversity, either social economic diversity or ethnic diversity or both, I don't think you can actually say that it's a flourishing congregation on biblical grounds. I think you can have a large congregation, but if you don't have the diversity, that diversity, I'm not sure you're reflecting the kingdom. Unquote. Another member of the same focus group, the conservative Protestant pastor, stresses, I think a flourishing congregation is one that's diverse in its generations, in its ethnicities. I think a comment was made in this focus group. He said it reflects the community it's in. If your church is all white and it's surrounded by tons of different ethnic populations, I wonder what's going on there. Like if there's an awareness about that, that's really sad. Unquote. Recent research reveals that ethnic diversity is more common in Canadian congregations than in the United States. Ethnic diversity is a narrative that we heard loud and clear in all of our Catholic interviews, and to a lesser extent in some conservative Protestant settings. This narrative was prominent in the major urban centers of Toronto, Vancouver, and Calgary, revealing the impact that contextual and demographic variables can have on the congregation. In addition to the ethnic diversity, a leader in Winnipeg talked about a millionaire sitting alongside an unemployed person in his congregation, while others spoke about members of the LGBTQ community actively participating as full members in their congregation, especially within the United Church of Canada setting, and in millennial-based congregations. Some leaders said that various expressions, I need to wind this up here, various expressions of diversity discussed thus far is a lived reality for their leadership group as well, right? Not just the congregation, but who is leading. It's gratifying to me to serve on a board of a church in this city where we just elected a brother from India and a brother from Nigeria to our board in a largely white church. It's about time. And we realize that. And these are guys that have been very much involved in the congregation. It's wonderful. That's not part of the study. That's free. Some leaders say that various expressions of diversity discussed thus far is a lived reality from their leadership group through those sitting in the pews, while others in the study, they agree that diversity is important, but diversity remains an aspiration they're still pursuing. Amidst the discussion about diversity, several leaders articulated their commitment to congregational culture, and I love this, where questioning and uncertainty regarding one's faith is welcome and even preferred. I grew up in a very airtight Protestant evangelical church where I had questions, not doubts, but questions that were treated as doubts, so they became doubts. A homogeneous congregation that stifles diverse questions, doubts, and experiences was stigmatized as a congregation that surely is not flourishing. One United Church of Canada minister reflects this way. In our community, who would be flourishing would be curiosity, openness, question, non-prescriptive theology, more descriptive. Our experience is that people are seeking to belong, and they want to figure out how it's worked. Then they finally figure out what they believe. We might be unique to our community, but it's certainly thriving because people are welcome to question. They become aware that that's biblical and essential to a flourishing faith. That may not be perceived by others as the right way, but certainly in our community is seeking a kind of community, is a seeking kind of community. So the thriving to me, or the flourishing is, there's a certain element of doubt and a certain element of curiosity that, like Thomas, was willing to question. Well, much more I could say. Let me just come and read one or two more statements here. As our project unfolds, we have several questions that we want to explore regarding diversity. Are flourishing congregations actually diverse? And if so, along what social lines? Secondly, do members of different subgroups interact with members of other subgroups in the congregation, as Joel already alluded to earlier? And if so, in what extent, in what manner do they do so? How do members feel and act toward those other groups, quote unquote, within the congregation, however they're defined? How are diverse perspectives among and between church leaders and congregants presented and approached in settings where leaders value questioning and uncertainty? Diversity. There we are. Thank you. Joel.
We realize it's like drinking water from a fire hose, trying to dissect all of this, and so we appreciate your patience in going through these things. If we were to create or recreate this brochure that you find in your folders today, we would probably use these as the anchoring ideas based on what we've explored thus far. And they may change between now and the end of this initial 3-year project, and we're very open to those. Here's 3 brief conclusions by way of tying these things together that stand out to us. I think first, our sense is that Canadian leaders are keenly aware of the highly secular context that they minister within. And we get this strong sense that there is a sense of urgency to act within that secular context, across the continuum, Catholic, mainline, conservative, Protestant settings, whether it's trying to clarify and sharpen their identity, whether it's leadership development and thinking about what this means for the next generation. And we heard all kinds of comments to this effect. How will the decisions that we make in our congregation impact the next generation? What does that stewardship piece look like on a series of things? To thinking outside of the box, trying new things without reservation. Because in some respects, some would say we have nothing left to lose within this secular context. And so we're going to go all in. And we're going to try new things, and some things may not work, and that's okay. we don't see that as failure, but we actually see that as a seed for another good idea as we seek to respond to the needs around us. Whether it's the structures or processes that they have in place that make it clear for people who are joining groups, for discipleship and so forth. All of these kinds of things we see as largely embedded within a context that people see. We are in a secular Canadian context, and it creates a sense of urgency in response to that. Second, I think many that we spoke to are keenly aware of the negative perceptions towards Christianity and toward congregations. There is a sense of trying to grapple with the brand image, whether it's collaborative leadership as a response to this narrative of hierarchical top-down leadership. They see this as a way of trying to change some of the discourse there, to create space and dialogue for people to question, to voice their uncertainties, to be actively engaged in the community around. These things, one might argue, is in part a response to the broader Canadian perception toward religious groups and how one might respond to those things. And then third, diversity. I don't know if we could say this is a specific made in Canada response. I think we're still trying to parse through that. But is there something theologically and or culturally of these leaders who say that this is actually a hallmark of a flourishing congregation, that it is diverse, that it brings together people of different age groups, family status, sexual orientation, race and ethnicity, of all these different things coming together as a quintessential expression of, quote, the kingdom of God? So we're trying to parse through that, sociologically, theologically, of how those things come together. As we look forward in our project, this initial project, in phase 2, we are beginning to lay some tracks for some in-depth case study research here in Calgary, with 3 Catholic, 3 mainline Protestant, and 3 conservative Protestant congregations. And our central question, growing out of some of the things we've talked about today, is this. What are the social narratives and experiences and processes and conditions and theological reasons that contribute to people joining and getting involved in flourishing congregations in Catholic, in mainline, and conservative Protestant settings in Canada? And so we plan to have some very in-depth time on the ground, so to speak, of attending religious services, of conducting interviews and focus groups, not just with paid clergy, but with lay leaders within the congregation, to conduct surveys with members of those congregations to try to tease out some of these ideas that we've alluded to here. And this sets us up for phase 3, at least as we envision it right now, and perhaps this will change as we receive feedback and as we work through, is to conduct a national study of primarily congregants in flourishing congregations. Our goal would be to survey 1,500 plus members of congregations across this country, to test a number of the questions and hypotheses raised thus far this morning, as well as new questions that would emerge in our current data analysis from phase 1 and the findings from phase 2. And we think that this kind of survey will give us a window into some of the demographic realities and perspectives among congregants themselves that may validate or challenge some of what we have heard from leaders in phase 1 of the project. And so that's a little bit of a high level of where we're possibly moving from out of this first phase of research. Our plan, we're going to break for lunch momentarily. After lunch,